That's me, Sukhvinder. This is going to be quite serious, just to be warned. It's not going to be fun as the other talk. I'm Sukhvinder, so I work in enterprise data. So enterprise data is the part of the bank which handles all the data applications. Across the bank, lots of data floating around, lots of technologies, legacy, new technologies. I deal with all of that. The latest thing we're going to be looking at is open source. So we're going to try to use a lot more open source tooling within enterprise data. And I'm going to talk you through the challenges and the kind of things we're looking at. So, okay, everybody knows what open source is, but the things at the bottom there, you can see there, we're a bank, we're not a tech company. And we can't do things very easily. The other thing is that one of the biggest questions we get about open source is who's going to support it. So we had a couple of people previously talking about how they develop products and they do it for themselves and they maintain it. If they like it, there's no damage done. In a bank, it's not that easy. The first question they ask, you want to use open source, who's going to support it? And that's the biggest challenge. And I'll talk you through some of the challenges there. So the kind of tools that we work with in the bank. So people in the audience may have seen all of this. These are the popular tools that we look at. Jenkins being for orchestration. We use things like Terraform, Airflow. These are all technologies related to data. But the key thing is these are all open source. They're all open source. They're managed in the community, but we use them internally in the bank as consumers. That's all we do as consumers. So, a couple of things that we want to talk about, the challenges we're facing. There are a number of challenges. There's a big statement there. I'm not going to read all of that. But a couple of challenges is first around contribution and governance. So, governance is very key in a bank. Everything we do inside of the bank has to be governed, has to be secure, has to be compliant. So we can't just bring in technology out of the community into the bank. Impossible, it can't happen. The other thing is around maintenance. If we are using open source software, how are you going to maintain it? Who's going to look after it? Do you have enough people in the bank who understand software engineering? They have the right skills? Open shop, publishing. Once we've overcome these challenges, we can think about publishing open source into the community, but we're never going to get there if we don't get past the first hurdle, which is governance and contribution. So what's happening in the banking industry at the moment? There's lots of banks. You can see Finos there as well. There's lots of banks and institutions who are using open source technology. So NatWest, Capital One, Deutsche Bank, they have all developed a pathway into open source technology, and they're using it quite effectively. Capital One, for example, they have over 100 projects in the open source community that they're using. So they have built the governance, they've built the pathway for engineers to work in the open source community. So what can we do about this? What kind of models are available for open source when we're looking in a highly regulated banking environment where we can't just bring things in and we can't just use it? A couple of models. The simplest model is called an inner source model. So an inner source model is basically taking your open source software, bringing it internally into your organization and managing it internally. In the Google world, so Google called this a monorepo. So a monorepo being we've taken open source code, we brought it internally. Now internally we manage it, we take care of it, we build it, and we do everything internally. There is no need for us to go outside into the community other than getting a new release. The proper way of doing it, what some of the people have talked about today is a proper open source model. I called it an outsource model. So this is where we are contributing, we are making enhancements, we are collaborating with a global community of engineers. So we're using the the power of the open source community to use the software. So in terms of patterns, how do we do this then? We've got an open source model, we've got an inner source model. How do we use this then? What kind of patterns are available? So if we're looking from a banking point of view, inside a highly regulated environment where things are not easy, a couple of options available for us. First one, I call this inner source light. So this is not anything which has been taken, from any textbooks or anything. It's just as it sounds. So we're taking inner source, we're taking open source code, and we're bringing it internally, as I mentioned previously. But what the difference here is, we are using suppliers which are already in the bank. So big organizations have lots of partnerships with very, very big organizations. It could be IBM, it could be the Indian software companies like Wipro, etc. They all have big relationships with those suppliers. So inner source light is a way of consuming open source software and leveraging on your partners. So your partners being IBM, etc., and making sure whatever you're using is in sync with what they would use. So that gives you a little benefit. You can lean on them. The other model is around inner source roots, and I mentioned this briefly. So we're taking open source software, bringing it internally, we're managing it internally. We don't need the hassle of going to contribute, getting our engineers, making sure that they've got the pathway, they've got the right governance, they've got the clearance to contribute in the community. So you're doing everything internally. Outer source roots is again, contribution. It's just advocating that open source relationships and working out in the community. And the final one is outer source providers. So this is something similar to outsourcing your open source. So I've got, I'm interested in a particular open source tool or a software product. I don't want the maintenance. I don't want to take it on. Let's outsource it. Let's find a supplier who can manage it for us internally and provide the enterprise support. So these are the options available. I'm not going to tell you which one's my favorite, but obviously there's a number of options how you can tackle this. So let me just very, very quickly walk you through a couple of these models. So when we talk about inner source light, if you can see from left to right, inner source light. So you're a consumer of open source. So basically you're going to consume artifacts from the community. So that artifact could be your code, it could be a source code, it could be images. So you may want to pull down a Docker image already ready for you. So you do the first thing, you bring it down. The second thing is, you look at your suppliers internally. Who do you have internally who's quite active in the open source community? Do you have the likes of IBM? Do you have the likes of some of the Indian software companies who are already got a relationship in the community? So what we do, the first thing, we look at what versions they are using. And we do the same thing. We use the same version internally. Just to give you an example, is if you look at some of the cloud providers like Google. Google use under the skin of a lot of their products is open source. And they clearly document and say that we are using version XYZ for this particular software. So what we can do, we can also use the same version of what Google use in their products and also use that internally. And then in the event of a failure, if something happens or there's a bug, we don't need to go to the community to fix it. We say, Google, IBM, we've got a problem on this version, we spotted something, we can't go to the community, but you can. You're on the same version. Can you go out there in the community, collaborate and get it fixed for us? So this is a very light version. So we are only leveraging on our suppliers. So inner source roots, again, this is something when you're bringing it internally. The biggest problem here is if you look at step 3 in terms of the repository side. What's happening here is you are bringing software from the public domain internally. you are managing internally, you have got the challenge of building that software. So if you are going to build that software into a form where applications can use that, you've got that challenge of building it. So it's a very engineering heavy challenge, and basically it's going to need very, very competent engineers to work on this. So there's lots of limitations on that, but the positives on this, you don't need to go out in the community, you don't need that pathway, you don't need that clearance to go out there in the community. Outsource, everybody knows about that, but there's some challenges here in banking. So we are basically go outside of the community, we bring in some code internally. The job is not finished there. Once we are ready and say that, right, I want to make a change to a piece of software, there are a number of hurdles we have to go through. Number of being around licensing, the legal aspects, all the legal aspects around software has to be considered before anything is touched in the community. There is also the business risk. What is the risk upon the business you're using this? If you're using a high available service within a bank and you're using open source software, the business risk has to be established. And the other aspect of it is your CLA reviews, your contributor license agreements. What's in the agreement? That has to be studied quite thoroughly in terms of the legal aspect before you can even get anywhere near to the public domain. And the final one that I mentioned is similar to an outsourcing model. So you pull in the code, from the open domain, you bring it internally. I don't want the headache to fix this. I'm gonna procure some enterprise support from an external company, and our internal engineering community are going to work closely with this external company, and we're going to work together and we're going to fix it. But the external supplier who are providing the service, they are going to lead the relationship in the community. This way, you can lean on suppliers, you can make them do the work, but then internally the capability can build internally. So this is the easiest model, but it's the costly model. So if I had to just give you a little use case, certainly in my domain. So my domain is around data and data engineering. So everything we do is around data engineering. And if I had a use case and said that I want particular products in the open source community, let's say, for example, you may have heard of Apache Beam. Apache Beam is a framework, an open source framework that provides unified data processing. So inside of Apache Beam, you can use something else called Apache Spark. So Spark is inside of Beam is a runner. So the runner could be anything. It doesn't have to be Spark. It could be Flink. It could be anything else. So this is just a hypothetical use case, just to give you an idea. So we've gone out and we said, right, we've got a use case for Beam and Spark. Job done. We can go out to the community, pull the code in, then what happens next? So what we do here is, if we look at a supplier like Google offer a service inside of their offerings called Data Proc. So Data Proc is built upon a lot of the Apache Hadoop stack. So people are familiar with Hadoop. There's components under there like Hive, HDFS, Beam, Spark, all of those good things. And underneath the skin of that product, they specify what versions they use. So they may be using version whatever, XYZ. So why don't we lean on Google and say that, right, Google are using version 2.0 in Dataproc. Why don't we do the same thing? If we got a simple use case, let's sync our versions with what Google are using on Dataproc. They're using version 2, we'll use the same thing. So that's what we do. So here you can see Apache Beam, we're going to sync up with Google, our big supplier, and we find a problem. We're using Spark, Beam, whatever we're using, we find a problem. Somewhere, we've hit a problem and we've gone out to the community and looked at the problem, and yes, it is a defect. Okay, what happens? We go back to our supplier and say, supplier, we've got a problem with this version. You're on the same version, we're on the same version. Can you go out there and fix it? Can you go out there in the community with your influence in the community, and can you get this fixed for us? This is inner source light. So we are not having to invest in a lot of engineering expertise. We're leveraging on our suppliers to help us do this. And so this is an easy way for us to adopt open source inside of the bank. And not by means the preferred way, but it's the easiest way to lean on your suppliers. So I think that's all I have to offer. So this is just to give you an insight on what we're doing. There's more going on inside of the bank in terms of how we're trying to adopt open source, but it gives you an idea of the different models that we can utilize in a highly regulated environment. It's not as simple as bringing something in and adopting it. There's a lot more governance, and there's a lot more clearance, and in terms of employee contracts that one has to consider. Thank you very much.